The cold bit through her thin coat as Margaret Hoffman stepped off the train onto the wooden platform in rural Iowa. It was January 1945, and the winter wind swept across endless white fields that stretched farther than her eyes could see. She had expected shackles. She had expected shouting guards with rifles raised, perhaps dogs straining at their leashes. She had expected America to be the nightmare that every poster in Vienna had promised it would be. Instead, standing at the edge of the platform, wrapped in a heavy wool coat with flour dust still clinging to her apron, was a woman. Not a soldier, not a guard. Just a woman, perhaps 40 years old, with kind eyes and work-worn hands. The farmer's wife walked forward slowly, as if approaching a frightened animal, and then did something that would haunt Margaret for the rest of her life. She opened her arms and pulled her into an embrace. The hug lasted only a few seconds, but in that moment, everything Margaret had been taught about America, about the enemy, about the fate awaiting captured soldiers, shattered like ice under a hammer. The woman smelled of bread and soap. Her arms were strong from years of farm work, yet gentle. When she pulled back, she looked directly into Margaret's eyes and said something in English that the translator beside her repeated in German. "Welcome to Iowa. You're safe here." Margaret's knees nearly buckled. She had been prepared to die in America. She had not been prepared for kindness. For 23-year-old Margaret, the war had been a slow descent into nightmare. She had grown up in a small village outside Salzburg, the daughter of a postal clerk and a seamstress. Her Austria had been green mountains, church bells on Sunday mornings, and the smell of Apfelstrudel cooling on her mother's windowsill. Then came the Anschluss in 1938, when Austria ceased to exist as a nation and became part of Hitler's Greater German Reich. The cheering crowds in Vienna meant little to her village, but the changes came swiftly. Her older brother was conscripted into the Wehrmacht. Her father joined the party because refusing meant losing his job. And Margaret, like thousands of young Austrian women, was eventually recruited into auxiliary services. She had worked as a clerk in a military supply depot in northern Italy, far from the front lines, but close enough to hear the distant thunder of artillery. She typed requisition forms, filed reports, and tried not to think about what those supplies were used for. In her heart, she had never believed in the 1,000-year Reich or the Führer's promises. She had simply tried to survive. Then came the Allied advance through Italy in 1944. The depot was overrun. She and 24 other Austrian women were captured by American forces advancing north. The soldiers had been professional, almost bored as they processed the prisoners. But the propaganda Margaret had been fed for, years screamed in her mind. The posters, plastered across every depot and barracks, had shown Americans as gangsters and savages, a mongrel nation without culture or honor, where prisoners were worked to death in labor camps or simply shot. Radio broadcasts had warned that women captured by the Americans would face unspeakable horrors. Yet the first thing the American soldiers did was give them food, real food, white bread, canned meat, even chocolate. Margaret had stared at the rations in disbelief, unable to reconcile the generosity with the monsters she'd been taught to fear. The journey across the Atlantic had been long and cramped, but not cruel. The women were held in the cargo hold of a Liberty ship, packed together on narrow bunks, but they were fed daily and allowed on deck for fresh air. Margaret had stood at the railing one morning, watching the endless gray ocean, and whispered to another woman, "If they mean to kill us, why feed us so well?" The other woman, an older nurse from Innsbruck, had no answer. Rumors swirled constantly among the prisoners. Some said they would be taken to camps in the desert and forced to build roads until they died of heat stroke. Others whispered that America's factories needed slave labor, that they would spend the rest of their lives in windowless workshops assembling bullets for the guns that would kill their own brothers. A few clung to hope, repeating stories they had heard about the Geneva Conventions, international laws that were supposed to protect prisoners. But most dismissed this as fantasy. Laws meant nothing in total war. When the ship finally docked in New York Harbor, Margaret glimpsed the Statue of Liberty through the porthole. She had seen photographs of it in school, always accompanied by contemptuous commentary about America's hollow promises of freedom. But seeing it in person, massive and green against the winter sky, stirred something unexpected in her chest. It looked permanent, unbombed, untouched by war. From New York, they traveled by train westward. For 3 days, Margaret pressed her face against the window, watching America roll past, cities that gleamed with electric lights, farmland that stretched unbroken for miles, factories with smokestacks pumping out production. She saw no ruins, no bombed-out husks of buildings, no starving refugees huddled by the roadside. Everything looked whole, prosperous, untouched. The other women noticed it too. "How can they still have all this?" one murmured. "We were told America was suffering, that their people were starving, that the war was breaking them." But there were no signs of suffering. There were only fields and cities and people going about their lives as if the world were not tearing itself apart. When the train finally stopped in rural Iowa, Margaret and 5 other Austrian women were unloaded along with their meager belongings. A handful of guards accompanied them, but the men seemed relaxed, almost friendly. One of them, a young private who could not have been older than 20, helped carry their bags to the waiting trucks. He smiled at Margaret and said something she did not understand, then handed her a piece of gum. She took it hesitantly, still waiting for the trap to spring. The trucks drove them through farmland, blanketed in snow. Iowa in January was a landscape of whites and grays, bare trees standing like sentinels along frozen roads. The farms they passed looked prosperous. Barns painted red, houses with smoke curling from chimneys, silos filled with grain. It was so different from the Austria she had left behind, where every resource had been squeezed dry for the war effort. When the truck stopped in front of a large farmhouse, Margaret climbed down and stood shivering in the cold. The farmhouse was 2 stories tall, white with green shutters, surrounded by outbuildings and fields that disappeared into the horizon. It looked like a postcard. A man emerged from the barn, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing overalls and a thick jacket. He waved to the guards, then walked toward the women with an expression that was curious but not unkind. And then the farmer's wife stepped out onto the porch. She was not a large woman, but she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime managing a household and helping run a farm. Her hair was tied back in a practical bun, and her dress was simple, covered by the flour-dusted apron. She descended the porch steps and walked directly to Margaret, the youngest and most visibly frightened of the group. The translator, an older Austrian man who had been living in America before the war and now worked for the military, said something to the farmer's wife. She nodded, then looked at Margaret with an expression that seemed to see straight through her. That was when she opened her arms. Margaret hesitated. Her body was rigid with fear, with confusion, with the weight of months in captivity and years of propaganda. But the woman's face was so open, so genuinely kind, that something inside Margaret cracked. She stepped forward, and the farmer's wife wrapped her arms around her. The embrace was firm and warm, the kind of hug a mother gives a daughter. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She had not been hugged like this since before the war. When the farmer's wife released her, she spoke again. The translator relayed her words. "You've come a long way. You must be exhausted and hungry. Let's get you inside where it's warm." The farmhouse kitchen was a revelation. A black iron stove radiated heat, filling the room with warmth that soaked into Margaret's cold bones. The kitchen table, large and wooden and worn smooth by years of use, was set with plates and cups. And the food. Margaret stared in disbelief. Fresh bread, still warm from the oven. A pot of stew simmering on the stove, rich with the smell of beef and vegetables. Butter, real butter, in a ceramic dish. A pitcher of milk. A plate of cookies, golden and dusted with sugar. The other Austrian women stood frozen in the doorway, their eyes wide. One of them whispered in German, "This must be for the family. We'll be given scraps later." But the farmer's wife gestured for them to sit, and the translator confirmed what seemed impossible. This meal was for them. Margaret lowered herself onto a wooden chair, her hands trembling. The farmer's wife ladled stew into her bowl, then placed 2 thick slices of bread beside it. She poured milk into Margaret's cup, then stepped back with a satisfied nod. "Eat," the translator said. "You're too thin." Margaret picked up the spoon. The stew was hot and rich, better than anything she had tasted in years. The bread was soft and buttery, the milk was cold and fresh, not the watered-down substitutes she had grown accustomed to in Europe. She ate slowly at first, afraid it might be taken away, then faster as hunger overtook caution. Around her, the other women did the same, their faces a mixture of disbelief and relief. The farmer's wife watched them with a gentle smile, then turned to the stove to refill bowls as they emptied. Her husband sat at the far end of the table, quiet but not hostile. Their 2 children, a boy of about 10 and a girl of perhaps 7, peeked around the doorway with wide, curious eyes. The translator spoke to the children, and they giggled before running off. When the meal was finished, Margaret sat back in her chair, her stomach fuller than it had been in months. She looked around the kitchen, at the clean walls and the shelves lined with preserves, at the warmth and the light and the sense of safety that filled the room. This was not a prison. This was a home. The farmer's wife reached across the table and placed her hand over Margaret's. She spoke softly, and the translator relayed her words once more. I know you've been through terrible things. I know you're far from home and you're frightened. But while you're here, you're not just a prisoner. You're a person, and we'll treat you like one. Margaret felt the tears come then, hot and unstoppable. She wept openly, and the farmer's wife did not pull away. She simply held Margaret's hand and let her cry. The other women at the table wept too, their shoulders shaking with the release of fear they had carried across an ocean. In that moment, Margaret understood something profound. The greatest weapon America possessed was not its factories or its soldiers or its endless fields of grain. It was this: the simple, quiet belief that even enemies deserved dignity. That kindness was not weakness, but strength. That a farmer's wife could embrace a prisoner of war and in doing so win a battle no army could ever fight. The cold Iowa wind howled outside the farmhouse, but inside, in the warmth of that kitchen, something impossible had begun. Healing, understanding, and the first fragile threads of reconciliation between women who just months before had been sworn enemies. Margaret did not yet know what the future held. She did not know if she would ever see Austria again or if her family had survived the war. But in that moment, held by the kindness of strangers in a land she had been taught to hate, she felt something she had not felt in years: hope. That first night, Margaret lay in a small but clean bedroom on the second floor of the farmhouse, staring at the ceiling and struggling to make sense of her new reality. She shared the room with another Austrian prisoner, a woman named Helene, who had worked as a nurse in a field hospital before capture. The bed had clean sheets, real sheets, not the rough burlap they had slept on during transport. A quilt lay folded at the foot of the bed, handmade with careful stitching in a pattern of blue and white squares. Through the window, she could see the moon casting silver light across the snow-covered fields. Everything was so quiet. No air raid sirens, no distant explosions, just the occasional creak of the old house settling and the whisper of wind against the glass. Helene whispered in the darkness, "Do you think this is real? Or are we being fattened up for something worse?" Margaret had no answer. She pulled the quilt over herself and closed her eyes, too exhausted to untangle hope from fear. Morning came with a knock on the door. The farmer's wife, whose name they learned was Dorothy Muller, stood in the hallway with 2 sets of work clothes folded neatly in her arms. She smiled and gestured for them to dress and come downstairs. Breakfast was already waiting. Eggs, bacon, toast with jam, and coffee so strong it made Margaret's eyes water. The farmer, Henry Muller, sat at the head of the table reading a newspaper. He nodded to the women, but said little. His presence was calm, unhurried, the bearing of a man who had seen many seasons come and go and understood that work, not worry, was what kept a farm running. After breakfast, Dorothy led them outside to show them the work they would be doing. Iowa in January meant indoor tasks mostly. There were eggs to collect from the chicken coop, where hens clucked and fluffed their feathers in the warmth of straw-lined nests. There was butter to churn, a rhythmic task that made Margaret's arms ache within minutes. There were vegetables from the root cellar to sort and clean, potatoes and carrots and turnips that would feed the household through the winter. And there was endless mending, sewing, and preparation for the spring planting that would come in a few months. The work was hard, but it was honest. Margaret had expected cruelty or exploitation, but instead she found herself treated like a hired hand, not a slave. Dorothy worked alongside them, showing them how things were done on an Iowa farm. She spoke slowly, using gestures when words failed, and her patience was remarkable. When Margaret accidentally dropped a basket of eggs, shattering half of them on the frozen ground, she braced for punishment. Instead, Dorothy simply sighed, handed her a rag, and said through the translator who visited weekly, "It happens. Just be more careful next time." Within days, Margaret began to understand the scope of what she had stumbled into. The United States faced a labor crisis unlike anything in its history. By 1945, over 12 million American men were serving in uniform overseas. Farms across the Midwest, which had always relied on strong backs and long hours, were left desperately short-handed. Iowa alone, one of the nation's most productive agricultural states, saw its farm workforce shrink by nearly 40% during the war years. Crops needed planting, harvesting, and processing. Livestock needed tending. Food production could not stop, not when America was feeding not only its own population, but also supplying millions of rations to Allied forces across Europe and the Pacific. The solution came in the form of prisoners of war. By 1945, the United States held approximately 480,000 Axis prisoners, the vast majority of them German and Austrian soldiers captured in North Africa and Europe. Smaller numbers of Italian prisoners had arrived earlier in the war. These men and women represented an enormous potential labor force, and the U.S. government, following the Geneva Conventions, allowed them to be assigned to agricultural work in exchange for small wages. The prisoners earned 80 cents per day, paid not in cash but in canteen credits that allowed them to buy toiletries, cigarettes, and small luxuries in the camp stores. For farmers, it was a bargain. For prisoners, it was bewildering. They had expected punishment, not paychecks. Iowa became home to several large prisoner-of-war camps and dozens of smaller branch camps scattered across the state. Camps near Algona, Clarinda, and Fort Dodge housed thousands of men. But the women prisoners, far fewer in number, were often assigned directly to farms where labor shortages were most acute and where the presence of American farm wives made their work assignments less controversial. Margaret and her fellow prisoners quickly realized they were part of a system far larger than themselves. They were cogs in the machine of American agricultural might, a machine that ran with a precision and abundance that left them speechless. The numbers told a story that propaganda could never erase. Each prisoner received a daily ration of 3,200 calories, the same amount allocated to American soldiers. For women who had survived on ration cards in Austria, where daily calories often dipped below 1,000 in the war's final years, this was staggering. Breakfast alone, eggs and bacon and toast and coffee, contained more food than many of them had eaten in an entire day back home. Margaret wrote in a letter to her mother, later censored but eventually delivered, "We eat like royalty here, Mama. I weigh more now than I did before the war. I am ashamed to say it, but it is true. The abundance extended beyond food. Iowa's farms produced corn, soybeans, wheat, oats, and livestock on a scale that dwarfed European agriculture. A single Iowa farm might span 500 acres or more, worked with tractors and mechanical harvesters that seemed like something from a dream." Margaret had grown up around small farms in Austria, where a family might own 20 acres and plow with horses. Here, machines did the work of 100 men. Dorothy showed her the tractor one morning, a massive green John Deere that rumbled to life with a roar. Margaret watched in awe as Henry drove it across a field, pulling a plow that turned the frozen earth in neat rows. In one afternoon, he covered more ground than a team of horses could manage in a week. The efficiency was staggering. Iowa alone produced over 600 million bushels of corn in 1944, enough to fill railway cars stretching halfway across the country. The state's hog population exceeded 10 million animals, producing meat not only for American tables, but for soldiers fighting in France, Italy, and the Pacific. And this was just one state. Margaret began to understand what the other prisoners whispered at night. If America could spare this much food, this much machinery, this much labor to keep its farms running while fighting a two-front war, then the Axis had never stood a chance. Cultural misunderstandings were inevitable, but they were bridged through work and patience. Language remained the greatest barrier. Margaret spoke only German and a little schoolgirl French. Dorothy spoke English, and a few phrases of German passed down from her own grandparents who had immigrated to Iowa in the 19th century. They communicated through gestures, through repetition, through the universal language of shared tasks. When Dorothy wanted Margaret to fetch water, she mimed carrying a bucket. When Margaret needed to ask where something belonged, she held it up and raised her eyebrows. Slowly, words began to stick. Bread, chicken, table? Good. Thank you. The Mueller children, young Tommy and his sister Clara, became unexpected teachers. Children have no patience for silence, and they chattered endlessly at Margaret and Helene, pointing at objects and repeating their names until the women could say them back. Tommy thought it was hilarious when Margaret mispronounced barn as bon, and he corrected her with the exaggerated patience of a 10-year-old who believed he knew everything. Clara, shy at first, eventually warmed to the women and began leaving little drawings under their bedroom door, pictures of chickens and horses and stick figures holding hands. Meals became the center of cultural exchange. Dorothy cooked in the American Midwestern style, hearty and simple. Pot roast with potatoes and carrots, fried chicken with mashed potatoes and gravy, casseroles made with corn, cheese, and breadcrumbs. Everything was rich, filling, and utterly foreign to Margaret's palate. She had grown up on schnitzel, dumplings, and strudel. This American food was different, but she learned to love it. One evening, Dorothy asked through gestures if Margaret could show her how to make something from Austria. Margaret, nervous but eager, prepared a simple apfelstrudel using apples from the Muller's root cellar. The house filled with the smell of cinnamon and baked fruit. When Henry took his first bite, he closed his eyes and nodded. Dorothy clapped her hands in delight. From that night on, apfelstrudel became a regular dessert, a small piece of Austria living in the heart of Iowa. The gradual breakdown of prejudice happened in these small moments. Margaret had been taught that Americans were materialistic, shallow, obsessed with money and machines. But Dorothy worked from dawn until long after dark, her hands rough and calloused, never complaining. She cared for her children, cooked for her family and the prisoners, tended the garden, preserved food for winter, and still found time to mend clothes and write letters to relatives. She was strong in a way Margaret had never associated with American women. And Henry, though quiet, commanded respect not through shouting or force, but through competence. He knew his land, his animals, his machines. He fixed what broke, planned for the seasons, and treated his workers, prisoner or not, with fairness. The humanity behind the wire fences, thin as they were, revealed itself in countless small kindnesses. One cold February morning, Margaret woke with a fever and a terrible cough. She tried to work anyway, terrified that illness would mean punishment or deportation to a harsher camp. But Dorothy took one look at her flushed face and immediately sent her back to bed. She brought up hot soup, a mustard plaster for Margaret's chest, and aspirin from the medicine cabinet. She sat beside the bed for an hour, placing cool cloths on Margaret's forehead and humming softly. When Margaret tried to apologize for not working, Dorothy shook her head firmly and said a single English word Margaret understood perfectly. Rest. Invitations to family dinners followed. At first, the prisoners ate separately, taking their meals in the kitchen after the Mueller family had finished. But within weeks, Dorothy insisted they all eat together. The table was crowded, Henry at one end, Dorothy at the other, the children squeezed in on the sides with Margaret and Helene filling the remaining chairs. Grace was said before every meal, a Christian ritual Margaret recognized from her own Catholic upbringing. The words were in English, but the sentiment was universal. Thank you for this food. Protect those far from home. Bring peace. On Sundays, the Muellers attended church in the nearby town, a small white building with a steeple that rose above the flat fields. One Sunday, Dorothy asked if Margaret and Helene would like to come. They hesitated, uncertain if prisoners were allowed such freedoms. But Dorothy simply handed them clean dresses, older ones that had belonged to her before the children were born, and said, "Everyone is welcome in God's house." The church service was in English, incomprehensible to Margaret, but the hymns were familiar melodies. She found herself singing along in German while the congregation sang in English, the same songs of faith carried across an ocean and a war. After the service, several church members approached, shook their hands, and welcomed them with smiles. One elderly woman, her eyes kind, said something that the pastor translated. "We're praying for your families. We hope they're safe." Margaret nearly broke down weeping. The psychological impact of dignity in captivity cannot be overstated. Margaret had expected to be broken, to lose herself in the dehumanization of imprisonment. Instead, she found herself treated with a respect she had not known even in her own country under the Reich. She was called by her name, not by a number. She was thanked for her work, not commanded. She was invited to sit at the family table, not forced to eat scraps in the corner. This treatment, so simple and so radical, reshaped how she saw herself and how she saw America. One evening, as winter began to soften into early spring, Margaret sat on the porch with Dorothy, watching the sun set over the fields. The sky blazed orange and pink, the colors so vivid they seemed unreal. Dorothy rocked slowly in her chair, knitting a scarf. Margaret tried to find the English words she had learned. "Thank you," she said haltingly, "for everything, for kind." Dorothy paused her knitting and looked at her. "You don't have to thank me," she said slowly, knowing Margaret would understand the tone if not all the words. "You're a person. That's enough." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition. She was seen. She was human. And in that moment, the war felt very far away. As spring arrived and the Iowa fields transformed from frozen white to muddy brown to vibrant green, something equally profound was transforming inside Margaret Hoffman. The ideology she had absorbed, sometimes willingly and sometimes simply through repetition and fear, was crumbling like old plaster from a damaged wall. Each day brought small revelations that contradicted everything she had been taught about America, about democracy, about the nature of strength and weakness. The collapse was not sudden or dramatic. It happened in moments so quiet she almost didn't notice until she looked back and realized how far she had traveled from the woman who had stepped off that train in January. The Nazi indoctrination had been thorough. From the Anschluss onward, Margaret had been immersed in propaganda that painted a clear picture of the world. Germany and Austria together formed the apex of European civilization, a people of culture, discipline, and destiny. The Führer was restoring order to a chaotic world. Jews were dangerous parasites, Slavs were subhuman, and Americans were the worst kind of enemy. Degenerate mongrels with no true culture, a nation of gangsters and capitalists who cared only for money, a weak and divided people who would crumble under pressure. She had not believed all of it, not deep in her heart, but when lies are repeated often enough and loudly enough, they seep in like water through cracks. Now, living on the Muller farm, she confronted the gulf between propaganda and truth. Americans were not weak. Dorothy Muller rose before dawn every day and worked until long after sunset, managing a household, raising children, preserving food, tending animals, and doing it all with a quiet strength that put the Reich's bombastic speeches to shame. Henry was not soft or decadent. He fixed machinery with his own hands, understood the land with the intimacy of someone who had spent a lifetime reading its moods, and made decisions not through ideology, but through practical wisdom. Their children were not spoiled or undisciplined. They had chores, responsibilities, and a respect for hard work that would have impressed any Hitler youth leader, yet they managed it without cruelty or fear. Democracy, which Margaret had been taught was chaos masquerading as government, revealed itself in small, everyday ways. The Mullers discussed politics at dinner sometimes, and Margaret was astonished to hear Henry criticize President Roosevelt openly, without fear, without looking over his shoulder for secret police. Dorothy disagreed with him about farm subsidies, and they debated it like equals, neither shouting, neither declaring the other a traitor. The local newspaper, which Henry read every morning, contained opinions from multiple perspectives, some supporting the war effort, others questioning certain policies. This was not the controlled press of the Reich, where every word had been vetted and approved. This was messy, complicated, and utterly free. Margaret realized with a shock that she had never truly understood what freedom of speech meant until she heard people exercise it without fear. Individualism, which Nazi ideology condemned as selfish and destructive to the collective good, was woven into the fabric of American life. The Muellers made their own decisions about how to run their farm, what crops to plant, when to sell their livestock. Yes, there were government programs and regulations, but these were debated and often challenged. Neighbors helped each other not because the state commanded it, but because it was the right thing to do. When a nearby farm lost its barn to a fire that spring, families from miles around showed up with tools and lumber to rebuild it. No party official organized it. No propaganda minister praised it. It simply happened, born from a culture that valued both independence and community. The work ethic Margaret observed was different from what she had known. In Austria under the Reich, work had been framed as duty, as sacrifice for the folk and the Führer. Here, work was personal. Henry took pride in his fields, in his cattle, in his machinery, not because it served some grand national destiny, but because it was his. He had built this farm with his own hands in the hands of his father before him. The fruits of his labor belonged to him and his family. That ownership, that personal stake, drove him harder than any slogan ever could. Margaret began to understand that capitalism, which she had been taught was exploitation and greed, was at its heart about this simple truth. When people owned the results of their work, they worked harder and better. The abundance she saw around her, the overflowing granaries and fat cattle in prosperous towns, grew from this soil. Letters home became Margaret's way of processing these realizations, though she knew every word would be read by censors on both sides. She wrote carefully, describing her work and the weather, the farm and the family, avoiding politics, but unable to hide the wonder creeping into her sentences. "Dear Mama," she wrote in March of 1945, "I am well and healthy. The family I work for treats me with great kindness. We have plenty to eat, more than I can finish some days. The farm here is larger than 10 farms at home combined. They use machines for everything. The children are polite and curious. I'm learning English slowly. The war feels very far away from this place. I think of you and Papa every day. I hope you are safe. I pray we will see each other again when this madness ends." Her mother's reply, which arrived in May after passing through military censors and Red Cross channels, was cautious but tinged with disbelief. "My dearest Margaret, we received your letter and thanked God to know you are alive and well. Your father and I can hardly believe what you describe. Plenty of food, machines on every farm. Are you certain this is not some trick? Here, we have so little. The city is damaged badly from the bombings. Many buildings are gone. We stand in lines for hours to get bread, and even then there's not enough. Your brother has not written in months. We fear the worst. Please be careful. Do not trust too easily. Come home to us when you can. I love you. Mama." Margaret read the letter 3 times, her heart breaking for her parents and aching with guilt that she lived in comfort while they suffered. She wanted to tell them the truth, that no, it was not a trick, that America's abundance was real and staggering, that the war had touched this land so lightly it might as well be happening on another planet. But she knew such words would only deepen the wound. How could she explain that her captivity was kinder than their freedom? Other Austrian prisoners received similar letters. They shared them quietly in the evenings when the work was done, reading passages aloud in hushed voices. The contrast between their experience and the reality in Europe became impossible to ignore. One woman, captured in France and assigned to a farm near Des Moines, wrote to her sister, "They gave us turkey for Easter." Turkey, Anna. I'd forgotten such birds existed. The family invited us to their church and their table. Old women hugged me and called me dear child. I wept because I remembered we were supposed to be enemies, but I could not feel it anymore. As spring turned to summer, the work on the Mueller farm intensified. This was planting season, and every hand was needed. Margaret and Helene worked in the fields alongside Dorothy and Henry, planting corn in long, straight rows that stretched toward the horizon. The Iowa sun beat down mercilessly, and Margaret's back ached from bending, but there was a rhythm to the work that she found almost meditative. Plant, step, the seeds dropping into dark soil that smelled rich and alive. Dorothy worked beside her, faster and more efficient, but never impatient. She showed Margaret how to space the seeds properly, how to cover them just enough, how to move in a way that conserved energy over long hours. During water breaks, they sat in the shade of the wagon, and Dorothy shared stories about the farm, about growing up in Iowa, about meeting Henry at a church social when she was 18. Margaret understood perhaps half the words, but the tone carried meaning. This was a woman who loved her life, who found dignity and purpose in the work, who measured success not in conquest or glory, but in harvests and healthy children and a home filled with laughter. It was so far removed from the grand ideological visions of the Reich that Margaret almost felt embarrassed she had ever believed in such things. The children, Tommy and Clara, became Margaret's most effective teachers, not just of language, but of a different way of being. Children are unfiltered. They ask uncomfortable questions without guile. "Why do you talk funny?" Tommy asked one day while Margaret was feeding the chickens. "Where's your family? Do you miss them? Are you sad?" His questions were direct, sometimes painful, but never cruel. Margaret answered as best she could, and Tommy listened with the solemn attention children give to things they sense are important, even if they don't fully understand. Clara, younger and quieter, expressed her affection through small gifts. She brought Margaret wildflowers picked from the field edges, their stems clutched in her small fist. She drew pictures and left them on Margaret's pillow, crayon drawings of the farm, of the family, and always a small figure that Clara labeled in careful letters, Maggie, the nickname she had given Margaret because Margaret was too hard to pronounce. These gestures, so innocent and pure, broke through Margaret's defenses more effectively than any political argument could have. How could she see Americans as the enemy when this child loved her? One afternoon, in July, Tommy asked if Margaret would teach him a song from Austria. She taught him Edelweiss, the simple folk song about the small white flower that grew in the Alps. She sang it slowly, and Tommy repeated the German words with mangled pronunciation that made them both laugh. That evening, Tommy performed it for his parents at dinner, proud and slightly off-key. Henry smiled and Dorothy wiped a tear from her eye. Later, she told Margaret through gestures and halting words, "That song was beautiful. It reminded me that we're all just people who love our homes." Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Summer brought the 4th of July, America's Independence Day. The Mullers invited Margaret and Helene to join them for the town celebration. They dressed in clean clothes, climbed into the truck, and drove to the small town square where the entire community had gathered. There were speeches, and a band playing patriotic songs, and children running with sparklers as the sun set. Tables groaned under the weight of food brought by every family, potluck dishes of every description. Margaret watched American flags waving in the evening breeze, heard the crowd sing the national anthem with hands over hearts, and felt like an outsider looking through a window at something sacred. But then Dorothy took her hand and pulled her toward the food tables, introducing her to neighbors, and suddenly she was not outside anymore. She was included. People shook her hand, asked her name, welcomed her. One old farmer, his face weathered like dried leather, said through a translator who happened to be standing nearby, "My grandfather came from Germany. Welcome to America." As fireworks exploded overhead, painting the sky in red, white, and blue, Margaret stood between Dorothy and Helene and felt the full weight of understanding crash over her. This was why the Axis could never win, not because of tanks or planes or soldiers, though America had those in abundance, but because of this, a nation confident enough to celebrate its independence in front of enemy prisoners, a people secure enough to welcome strangers, a culture that believed so deeply in its own values that it did not need to hide them or force them on anyone. The math of defeat was not just economic or military, it was moral. She thought of the numbers she had learned. 480,000 Axis prisoners held in America, all of them fed, housed, and treated according to international law. 3,200 calories per day for each prisoner, while civilians in Europe starved. Iowa producing 600 million bushels of corn in a single year. American factories building 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. These numbers represented a capacity for production and organization that the Reich had never possessed and could never match. But more than that, they represented a society that functioned, that thrived, that turned abundance into strength. Without terror, without secret police, without concentration camps. Margaret whispered to Helene in German as the fireworks continued, "We were lied to about everything." Helene, her face illuminated by the explosions of light overhead, nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "We were. And now we know." The news arrived on a warm May morning in 1945, carried by the same truck that delivered mail and supplies to the Mueller farm. Henry came in from the fields early, his face unreadable, and turned on the radio in the kitchen. The broadcaster's voice crackled through static, formal, and momentous. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Victory in Europe Day, they were calling it. VU Day. Margaret stood frozen at the kitchen sink, a dish still wet in her hands, as the reality sank in like a stone through water. The Reich was finished. Hitler was dead, the announcer said, a suicide in a Berlin bunker. The 1,000-year empire had lasted just 12 years. She should have felt relief. She should have felt joy that the killing was over, that perhaps her family had survived, that she might finally go home. Instead, she felt only a hollow numbness mixed with dread. What home? What was left of Austria? The radio spoke of devastation, of cities reduced to rubble, of millions displaced, of a continent torn apart. Dorothy crossed the kitchen and placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder, saying nothing, just standing there in silent solidarity. Helene came down the stairs, having heard the broadcast from upstairs, and the two Austrian women looked at each other with eyes that held the same terrible question. What now? The celebration in town that evening was jubilant, but Margaret and Helene stayed at the farm. The Muellers did not press them to come. Dorothy prepared a quiet dinner, and they ate in near silence, the weight of history hanging over the table like smoke. Tommy, unable to contain his curiosity, finally asked, "Does this mean you get to go home now?" Margaret tried to smile. "Yes, I think so. Eventually." But Tommy, perceptive in the way children sometimes are, pressed further. "Do you want to?" Margaret did not know how to answer. She wanted to see her mother and father, to know if her brother had survived, to walk through the streets of Salzburg again. But she also dreaded what she would find. And a small guilty part of her did not want to leave this place, this farm, this family, who had shown her a kindness she had not known existed. The repatriation process began slowly. In the weeks following VE Day, military officials visited the POW camps and work sites across Iowa, explaining that prisoners would be returned to Europe in stages. Those with families and homes confirmed intact would go first. Those from areas now under Soviet occupation, which included much of Austria, faced a more complicated process. The world was being divided into zones, carved up by the victorious Allies. Austria, like Germany, would be split into this Hauptbau: American, British, French, and Soviet sectors. The Iron Curtain, though not yet named, was already descending. Margaret learned in late June that she would be repatriated in August. The news came through official channels, a form letter that gave her a date and a departure location. She would travel by train to a processing center on the East Coast, then by ship back across the Atlantic to Europe. From there, she would make her way to whatever remained of Austria. The letter was bureaucratic and cold, but it meant her time in Iowa was ending. She folded it carefully and placed it in the small wooden box where she kept her few possessions: letters from home, a photograph of her parents, a pressed wildflower that Clara had given her. Telling the Muellers was harder than she expected. She found Dorothy in the garden one afternoon, pulling weeds from between rows of tomatoes, and she struggled to find the English words she had learned over the past months. I go home. August. Dorothy straightened, brushing dirt from her hands, and her eyes immediately filled with tears. "Oh, Maggie," she said softly, using the nickname the children had given her. "I knew this day would come, but I'm not ready for it." She pulled Margaret into a hug, and they stood there among the tomato plants, holding each other while the Iowa sun beat down and the cicadas sang their endless summer song. The final weeks were bittersweet. Margaret worked harder than ever, as if she could store up the feeling of this place, this life, and carry it with her. She helped with the harvest, picking beans and peas, shucking corn, preserving food for the coming winter she would not see. She sat with Clara on the porch steps and braided the girl's hair while Clara chattered about school and friends and her plans to be a teacher someday. She played catch with Tommy in the yard, his throws wild and enthusiastic, her catches clumsy but improving. She baked apfelstrudel one last time, and the whole family ate it slowly, savoring each bite, knowing it would be the last for a long while. Dorothy organized a small farewell dinner the night before Margaret and Helene were to leave. The table was set with the good dishes, and Dorothy had cooked all of Margaret's favorite meals: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, corn on the cob, and apple pie for dessert. Neighbors came, families from nearby farms who had gotten to know the Austrian women over the months. They brought small gifts: a scarf hand-knitted by an elderly woman, a tin of cookies from another family, a Bible with an inscription in English that Margaret could not read but understood was meant as a blessing. The evening stretched long, filled with conversation that Margaret followed more by tone than by words, and when it ended, she hugged each person, thanking them in a mixture of German and broken English. That night, lying in bed for the last time in the small room with the blue and white quilt, Margarete could not sleep. She thought about the journey ahead, about the Austria she would find, about her family, and whether they were alive. She thought about the woman she had been when she arrived, frightened and hollow, and the woman she was now, stronger and changed in ways she could not fully articulate. She had come to Iowa a prisoner and was leaving as something else, not quite free, not quite whole, but more human than she had felt in years. The morning of departure was gray and overcast, the sky heavy with unshed rain. Henry loaded their small bags into the truck, and the family climbed in for the drive to the train station. The ride was quiet, each person lost in their own thoughts. At the station, other prisoners were already gathering, men and women who had worked on farms and in towns across Iowa, all of them preparing to return to a continent they barely recognized. Margaret stood on the platform, her bag at her feet, and turned to face the Mullers. Dorothy hugged her first, long and tight, whispering, "You'll always have a home here if you need one. Write to us, please. Let us know you're safe." Margaret nodded, unable to speak. Henry shook her hand, his grip firm, and said simply, "You're a good worker, Maggie. Best of luck to you." Tommy hugged her waist, his face pressed against her side, and mumbled something about missing her. Clara cried openly, her small face red and puffy, and Margaret knelt down to hold her. "Be good, little one," she said in German, knowing Clara would not understand the words, but hoping she would feel the love behind them. The train whistle blew. Margaret climbed aboard, found a seat by the window, and pressed her hand against the glass. The Mullers stood on the platform, waving, and as the train pulled away, they grew smaller and smaller until they were just shapes, then dots, then nothing. Margaret turned away from the window and wept. The journey back to Europe took weeks. The processing center in New Jersey was crowded and chaotic, filled with thousands of prisoners waiting to board ships. The Atlantic crossing was rough, the ship packed with repatriates, all of them subdued and anxious about what awaited them. When they finally reached the port in France, Margaret and the other Austrians were loaded onto trains heading east. The landscape they passed through was scarred and broken, villages destroyed, bridges collapsed, fields still pockmarked with craters. This was the Europe the war had created, and it was unrecognizable. Austria, when she finally reached it in September of 1945, was not the country she had left. Salzburg was damaged but standing, though pocked with bomb damage and filled with Allied soldiers. The zones were already in place, the city divided among occupying forces. Margaret made her way to her family's old address, her heart pounding, and found the building still intact. Her mother answered the door, and for a moment they simply stared at each other, unable to believe, and then they collapsed into each other's arms, sobbing. Her father emerged from the back room, thinner and older but alive. They held her between them, and Margaret felt the pieces of her heart begin to reassemble. But the reunion was bittersweet. Her brother was dead, killed in the final weeks of the war on the Eastern Front. Her childhood home in the countryside was gone, destroyed in fighting. Many of her friends had not survived. Austria was occupied, divided, its sovereignty suspended. Food was scarce, rationed even more strictly than during the war. The black market thrived. People moved through the streets like ghosts, haunted and hungry. Margaret, who had spent the last months eating 3 meals a day and sleeping in a clean bed, felt a crushing guilt that nearly overwhelmed her. Yet she also carried something else: hope, perspective, an understanding of what was possible when people chose abundance over destruction, cooperation over conquest. She told her parents about Iowa, about the farm, about the Muellers. Her mother listened with wide eyes, shaking her head in disbelief. And they just fed you? Treated you kindly? Even though you were the enemy? Margaret nodded. Yes, Mama. They did. Her father, practical and cautious, said, Then perhaps there is a way forward. If they can do that, maybe we can rebuild too. Margaret found work as a translator for the American occupation forces in Salzburg. Her English, learned from cowboys and farm families, was informal but functional, and the Americans appreciated her willingness to help. She became a bridge between the occupiers and the occupied, explaining Austrian concerns to American officers and translating American policies for her countrymen. In this role, she saw firsthand how the Marshall Plan began to take shape, how American aid flowed into Austria, rebuilding infrastructure, feeding the hungry, stabilizing the economy. It was the same abundance she had witnessed in Iowa, now deployed to heal a shattered continent. She wrote to the Muellers regularly. The first letter took months to reach them, routed through military postal channels. But when Dorothy's reply arrived, Margaret wept with relief. Dorothy wrote about the farm, about the children, about missing her and hoping she was safe. She included photographs, snapshots of Tommy and Clara standing in front of the barn, of the farmhouse in autumn with leaves turning gold and red. These images became Margaret's touchstones, reminders that kindness existed, that not all the world was broken. Over the years, the correspondence continued. Letters crossed the Atlantic several times a year, carrying news of births and deaths, harvests and hardships, the small details of ordinary life that stitched together friendship. In 1952, Dorothy sent a letter with a stunning offer. If you ever want to come back, we can sponsor you. There's a path for immigration now. You could live here, work here, make a life here. Margaret was tempted, desperately so, but her aging parents needed her, and Austria, slowly recovering, was becoming home again. She wrote back with gratitude and regret. Perhaps someday. Thank you for offering me a future. That future came for others. Several Austrian women who had worked on Iowa farms during the war did immigrate to America in the 1950s and 60s. They married American men, raised families, and became citizens, their accents fading but never quite disappearing. They carried with them the knowledge that enemies could become friends, that bridges could be built across chasms of hate. They became, in their quiet way, ambassadors of reconciliation. Margaret never returned to Iowa, but the Muellers visited Austria once, in 1968, a long-planned trip to see Europe. Margaret met them in Salzburg, now a woman in her 40s, and the reunion was joyful and tearful. They walked through the old city, visited the castle, Alte Sachertorte, in a cafe. Tommy, now a grown man with children of his own, towered over her. Clara, married and teaching school just as she had dreamed, held Margaret's hand as they walked. Dorothy, her hair now gray but her eyes still kind, said, You know, Maggie, you were never just a worker to us. You were family. Margaret nodded, her throat too tight to speak. When Margaret passed away in 1987, the Muellers sent flowers to her funeral in Salzburg, white roses that traveled across an ocean. Her obituary, published in the local newspaper, mentioned her wartime service and her work as a translator, but it also noted, simply, she was a prisoner of war who found kindness in captivity and spent her life building bridges between nations. The legacy of women like Margaret is difficult to quantify but impossible to dismiss. The humane treatment of prisoners of war by the United States during World War II, grounded in adherence to the Geneva Conventions and a belief in human dignity, reshaped how former enemies viewed America. For Austria specifically, a small nation caught in the maelstrom of German aggression, the experiences of POWs in America provided a counter-narrative to Nazi propaganda. They returned home with stories of abundance, fairness, and decency that helped lay the groundwork for strong post-war relations between Austria and the United States. The numbers bear this out. Of the approximately 480,000 Axis POWs held in the United States during the war, the vast majority returned home with positive or neutral views of their captors. Surveys conducted by the U.S. military found that over 70% of German and Austrian POWs felt they had been treated fairly. Many expressed surprise at the food, the working conditions, and the respect afforded them. These impressions, carried home and shared with families and communities, contributed to the relatively smooth reconstruction of West Germany and Austria in the post-war years. Former enemies became allies. Within a decade, a transformation aided by the fact that so many had seen America's character up close. The broader historical significance lies in this simple truth. Treaties and diplomacy rebuild nations, but human kindness rebuilds hearts. The farmer's wife who embraced a frightened prisoner on a cold January morning in Iowa did more to end enmity than any politician could have done with speeches. She offered dignity when humiliation would have been easier. She offered friendship when hatred would have been justified. And in doing so, she planted seeds of reconciliation that would grow for generations. Margaret understood this. In one of her final letters to Dorothy, written in the 1980s when both women were old and their correspondence had slowed, she wrote, "I have lived a long life, Dorothy, and I have seen much. But the moment I will carry with me into whatever comes next is the moment you hugged me on that platform. You did not see a prisoner. You did not see an enemy. You saw a person who needed kindness, and you gave it without hesitation. That embrace changed my life. It showed me that humanity can survive even in the darkest times. Thank you, my dear friend, for teaching me that love is stronger than hate, and that a single act of kindness can echo across a lifetime. It is that echo, carried across oceans and decades, that remains the truest legacy of the Austrian women prisoners who found themselves in Iowa during the final year of the Second World War. They came as enemies and left as witnesses to the transformative power of human dignity. And, in the years that followed, they helped build a world where former adversaries could become, against all odds, friends.